I'd like to welcome you all to Let's Talk, Iowa City's historic downtown. We're pleased with the turnout. It's a busy day in Iowa City, and we see that a lot of you understand the importance of having an interesting and a vibrant downtown. My name is Jenny Swaim, and I'm the chair of the Iowa City Historic Preservation Commission. And the commission comprises 12 citizens who are appointed by the City Council, and we represent various historic districts and the larger community. There's a lot of kickback on this. Are you hearing that too? Sounds okay? I'll persevere. The commissioners volunteer their time to identify and designate historic districts and landmarks, and we review applications for exterior changes in historic districts. Some of you may have gone through that if you're doing some changes on your houses in historic districts. We make recommendations to the City Council and boards and commissions, and in general, we encourage and celebrate preservation in all of its wonderful forms. So this is a kickoff, to use a fall football term, of our historic and architectural survey for our downtown. And first off, for funding the survey, we'd like to thank the Iowa City Council, as well as the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And thanks also to the Englert for allowing us to have this good conversation in a wonderful building. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Alexa McDowell. She'll be conducting the survey in the following months. Alexa is an architectural historian and the owner of AKAY Consulting in Minneapolis. She got her bachelor's in art and design at Iowa State.
Please don't boo.
I wasn't going to say anything. Did you not see the result of the football game last weekend?
I was watching it with my daughter. It was a painful.
Not for us. A master's in architectural studies with an emphasis in preservation and postgraduate work in history as well, all at Iowa State. She has worked at all levels of preservation, and that gives her a special kind of expertise, from serving on local commissions like ours to helping found a grassroots nonprofit in Perry, Iowa, that helped save and see to the rehabilitation of historic buildings. Today, working with communities throughout the Midwest in intensive level surveys, nominations to the National Register, tax credit applications, and pertinent to our kind of work today, placing on the National Register commercial downtown districts in Fort Dodge, Belle Plaine, Newton, Northwood, and Mason City, to name a few Iowa communities that have benefited from her work. But equally important to all this expertise, Alexa is skilled at helping a community understand its past and helping that community ask itself the challenging questions about its future. Please help me welcome Alexa McDowell. Thank you.
Perhaps I shouldn't have revealed to begin with that I'm a cyclone, but I trust that you'll forgive me that. I'm really happy to be here. I did grow up in Iowa. I'm a Fort Dodge girl, and I've lived a lot of my life in Iowa. Kind of went back and forth. I did spend a rather, inauspicious semester at the University of Iowa, where I think I garnered all of 6 credits and completed the entire John Jakes Civil War series while sitting by the banks of the river. So, many years later, here I am. So I really do appreciate the fact that I have this opportunity to work in Iowa City. I think it's very obvious to people who come here that we're in a special place. Having gone to school at Iowa State, I'm very familiar with the difference between the two campuses, and in particular, the difference between how the campuses relate to the community and the overlapping of those populations, which is really a wonderful thing, but it also creates an entire layer of challenges, which is a little bit of part of what we'll talk about. This is another true fact. I am so uncoordinated that I cannot handle a remote and a mic at the same time without falling off the stage. So Jessica's going to help me with that. So if you'll go on to the next slide, please. Can you guys see over me, or is it better for me to sit down? Now, these people are trying to see around me. What we're going to do tonight, I am going to stand down here, is we want to talk about the project that's underway. And if you haven't heard about it, basically this is a update of a survey and evaluation project that was done in 2001. In that project, Marla Svensson, who's a wonderful architectural historian who worked in this state for many years, prepared an evaluation. She looked at the historic buildings in the downtown, a larger area than encompasses the current project. She evaluated all of those for their ability to be eligible for the National Register, either individually or as a contributing resource to a potential historic district. And she created a report that outlined her findings, created a really wonderful background history about the growth of the downtown based on the early history of this community. And she made recommendations about what should happen from there. The timing was such that little happened from that. So at this point, the timing is new. There is renewed interest in the downtown and preserving its historic resources while allowing for the eventuality of evolution. And so we've returned to taking a look at that area again, a smaller area, and that's what this survey project is about. So the first component is looking at the buildings again and determining whether or not a historic district still remains, whether or not, what the boundaries of that historic district might be, whether there are individual properties that are not yet listed on the National Register but should be listed on the National Register. The other big part of this, let me tell you about the project area first. And so this is our the boundaries of the current project area. So we have Iowa Street on the north, Burlington on the south, Gilbert on the east, and Clinton on the west. And there's been a lot of change in that area, so that's part of the project itself. The other thing that we know is very important is there are a lot of complex issues in any community. And I think more so in Iowa City, perhaps because it's a growing community, because the university is here, because the proximity of the university and the population associated with the university, because of the really incredible and very important collection of historic buildings that are in this community. And so part of a really big, important part of this project is to talk to people, to hear varying perspectives, to gather those impressions and those ideas and those views and visions of the future, and create a recommendation in a report form again that tries to help pave the way or set a course for the future. And again, that's the summary report. So the pieces of that will be recommendations about National Register eligibility and how we progress from there. The presentation tonight is going to focus on these various things. One is to think about historic character. What defines historic character? What does that mean? In the commercial downtown, what are the various elements of the downtown? Not just the buildings, but the streets and the vegetation, the people, the activity, nodes of gathering, those sorts of things that help define this particular downtown. We're going to talk about the identity of the spaces, the inevitability of change, and we're also going to talk about sustainability, and we're going to take plenty of time to talk, to ask questions, to have discussion about these items and anything that you feel you'd like to contribute so that this process is as full and complete as possible. So, in the spirit of disclosure, I don't know why I thought this was important, but I do think that there is a preconceived notion that if you're a preservationist, that you believe that everything should be preserved. I don't take that position. What I believe is that the historic character of this town, the character of this town, the downtown, rests solidly on its historic buildings. And that approaching the future, preservation of historic buildings and the historic character has to be at the center of that. But I also believe in evolution. I believe that good architectural design will be important and part of the historic fabric in 50 years. And that if I was alive in 50 years and doing this project, that those buildings I'd evaluate and think that they belonged and they were a part of the historic fabric. I know that to be true. I won't go through all of these, but what I wanted you to understand from that is that there are many ways of looking at these things, and in order to look at them, we have to be honest and open about all of the different positions and all of the different possibilities and the potential conflicts and the challenges that are part of preservation, a part of a downtown. So these are the things specifically that we want to address about historic character. Age of a building, architectural style, scale, proportion, form, and continuity or context. And the reason that I pull those out is that when we look at a historic downtown and we try to decide whether or not it's eligible for the National Register, those are the things that I look at. They're also the things that I look at when I think about, okay, there's a potential for new development. How is it that we integrate new development into a historic setting and have it be appropriate? And these are the touchstones for analyzing that kind of new construction into an existing context. So change, right? This is a circa 1854, I think that's Iowa Avenue. And you can see we're a long way from that, right? And there are lots of things about this particular historic character that that we can identify and use as touchstones as we think about how things evolved over time. So when you look at an early streetscape like this, you're not surprised that we don't see cars and that the roads aren't paved. The other thing that I encourage you to look at is that there's very little vegetation, and that has something to do with how that space feels, right? The buildings are a variety of heights and shapes. So some of those early buildings had kind of a Dutch sort of influence or Flemish influence. The three-story here at the front is the one that I'm looking at in particular. But we have a lot of these wood frame buildings, one-stories that are to the foreground. Those were the early constructions. You know, communities all over the state of Iowa, they used the resources at hand when they started throwing up their first buildings, and those were by and large wood frame, unless you live someplace like Anamosa, where limestone was prevalent and it was easy to get to. But as communities, downtowns grew and there was more wealth, more population, then you started seeing the wood frame buildings disappear, or they burnt down before that point, and they were replaced with brick. So here we have a downtown street in the 1880s, and you can see wood frames by and large gone. I can't tell for sure if in this next block maybe there's one left in there. But primarily, by the 1880s, the visual character of downtown Iowa City had really settled into itself. Even without vegetation, cars, and paved streets, we can see a sense of continuity. The downtown commercial buildings were built to abut each other. Obviously, that's about money and making use of land space. They were 2- and 3-story buildings tall. They were by and large influenced by the Victorian era Italianate style. We do have a mansard roof here, which is a little kick from the French. But by and large, we had a contiguous, well-orchestrated growth of a commercial street. Here we go, this is Gilbert. And we can see the building that I always, my eye always goes to is the one that has the beautiful neoclassical front, has a pediment. Okay. But I'm sorry, you're right, this is Clinton. Thank you for correcting me. Thank you, I appreciate that. Yes, Clinton Street. and we're looking to the north, right? Thank you. Thank you, appreciate that. So at any rate, here we have, again, we have a series of contiguous masonry buildings, 3 stories, and very little variation in height. There is some with the addition of the attic level, and the pediment on that neoclassical building adds some height there. And as we see, it was adjacent to the churches at that time. Go ahead. So here we are on College Street. See? I'm from Iowa State. Did I tell you that part? So here we are on Washington Street, and of course we have the Englert. Englert was built in what, 12, 13? Say that again? 1912, thank you. And this is the Helen Paul or Paul Helen building next to it. Helen Paul. So Paul Helen, thank you. It was like multiple people were saying it, so it was coming at the same. At any rate, so here we have, the point being is that after the turn of the 20th century, that sense of continuity only increased. It became prevalent on all of the streets of the downtown. The difference that we began seeing here, and this is a pretty good example, the building clear to the right, which is a grocery store, still has the tall, narrow windows that mark it in the Italianate era. So it dates to pre-1900, 1880 era. The Paul Helen building post-dates it, and you begin to see the neoclassical or commercial classical influence in a very simplified cornice area. The windows are banded or grouped together. So, but we see this evolution. We also start seeing the change in the buggies, which are the precursors to the automobile. And are any of those, Lyle, or any of those cars? This is my automobile expert in the second row here. So progression though, evolution, but the continuity, the height, the scale and proportion of one to the other is intact. So here we have a really great, I think, comparison in terms of eras, and one that marks a shift in that continuity of style, proportion, and to some degree height. The building on the corner, which was First National Bank building, right, is really a 2-story building, but it's constructed in such a way that the first and second stories are equal, and as opposed to having storefronts, the windows are configured to service the bank function. The building has a flat roof with a very simple cornice. If you look to the right, we still have those very elaborate cornices that are indicative of the Italianate period. We still have that continuity. And at the end, if I'm right, we have this old city hall, and that's something we've lost. And that was a mammoth footprint. I mean, a large building of an early period that I think dated it to 1881 and was demolished. Does anybody know the year of the demolition? 68. So by the 1930s, this is a good view because it gives us both of the streetscapes. But by the 1930s, we can see with paving, the addition of parking, the amount of traffic, the signage, and even the light fixtures begins to change the sense of that character. I mean, if you imagine yourself in that first image, it feels very different than standing on the street, Washington, in the 1930s. But again, the continuity, sense of scale is relatively intact. This is the 1960s, and even here, which again is Washington, we have a sense of continuity in scale, but if you'll notice, the thing that's really changing is the flatness of the facades. So the Italianate, which we still see a lot on College on the Ped Mall, there are several examples that still remain with that beautiful elaborate cornice. These all have a very flat face, and that's a precursor to the modern era. By the mid 20th century, though, the second building over, which I can't read the name of that sign, does someone know the name of that building? Okay. That's a very modern building. Now, I didn't date that building, so I can't tell you when it was constructed, but I would date that facade to the mid-20th century, 1950-ish. And so the visual character in terms of style has begun to change. The feeling of being in that space is very different than it was in the 1850s, than it was in the 1880s, because of the change in the style of the buildings, the change in the traffic patterns, the prevalence of the auto, and the paving of the streets. And here's another of the 1970s, and we are on Clinton. Looking across the street again. And this is a very intact facade, streetscape facade. We lost the building on the end, which is now where the bookstore is, correct? And what that must have been dates to 1920s, the bookstore. And so that's a long-standing sort of streetscape. This I think is a good side-by-side, because I think the Astro, I swear that was in Fort Dodge, just exactly like that. The sign was the same, and that cladding, that curtain wall that they put over. And this is an example of how the character of a community changes when there's loss, and what replaces what is lost is less than what we lost, right? So the building that's hidden behind there, or that was replaced entirely, was undoubtedly, in my humble opinion, something that was far more beautiful than the Astro Theater and its gold facade. But still we maintain this continuity of buildings. And if I'm got my orientation straight, this is where Beatology is on the far right, and the empty lot is where City Hall was. Okay, thank you. And this is, gives us a view of downtown today. And so what we see is the new constructions that are 21st century constructions. So Sheraton is the end of the 20th century. But we see them as a backdrop now. They become a part of creating a canvas upon which the historic part of the downtown kind of rests against. And again, this block has changed quite a bit, but in terms of scale, form, and continuity, it's pretty well intact. The historic styles have been modified significantly over time. So, identity of spaces. So we talked about the buildings, the streets a little bit, vegetation, activity, and people. And in Iowa City, we go back to this view, which is Iowa, looking to the east. It's a very rural feeling, a very park-like setting, which in part is retained by the Pentacrest. So having the Pentacrest there helps maintain that sense of a park-like setting. That's kind of reiterated in the Ped Mall, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this sense of space here is also about the width of that road. And that road stays wide. I can't say that I know how much of that's been altered over time, but all you have to do is stand there and know that it's wider than a typical roadway, right? the addition of sidewalks and boulevard and those kind of things alter how we experience that. But the retention of Iowa as a wide street helps maintain a sense of the historic integrity of space that is part of the entire sense of historic integrity. So my point being that all of the components, building, space, vegetation, the roads, together create this sense of historic integrity. I thought this was funny. These are the engineers. They look like they're about as wild as any engineer I've ever seen. They're a serious crew. So here we are on Clinton again, looking to the south. There's that beautiful building. I just can't quit looking at it. Really beautiful building. The downtown, let me just say, I've talked to a lot of people so far, and I hope to talk to a lot more people. And there are many common threads in those conversations that I've had, but one common thread is that having people downtown and that being a mix of people is really important. And everybody recognizes that the long-term economic success of a downtown will result in our ability to save its historic buildings, to have a vibrant retail life, to have community gather together and be in a place where they feel like community. And so the people are really at the heart of all of those other things being successful. This is a great aerial view that illustrates multiple things. One is the density of the downtown. So there are a lot more holes now than are represented in this image, but it still remains a relatively dense downtown. In other places, on the fringes by Burlington, there is some large-scale growth that is reflected in terms of density. But it also shows that long-standing and very important relationship between the Pentecrest, the University of Iowa, and the downtown. This would be when Iowa State beat Iowa. No, Iowa wouldn't be celebrating, would they? This was when Iowa beat Yale in 1922. Do you guys ever do this? You stand by a building and, it's a building you've seen, every day. It's nothing that's new to you. And then you see a picture like this and you go, wow, my goodness, that building is so old, but also beautiful. And the story that it told when it's built is so different than the story it tells today. But in the same breath, kind of the same story. Do you know what I mean? Is that weird? But when I look at this and I see the buildings downtown, you walk these streets and you look at some of these buildings, and it helps me put into perspective how important it is that something lasts. Because so few things last. And so the joy that's in these streets, because the Iowa football team beat Yale, and I don't even know how much, but it's so real. And it brought to me really the meaning and the importance of historic buildings, historic spaces as memory makers. I just thought this was funny. These little carts were all over. Perry had one of these, and the popcorn lady popped popcorn every Friday night, and everybody from town came downtown and had popcorn. And that's what these people were doing. So, we have our food carts. Did they do that here in Iowa City? They're doing the food. So food carts are this hot thing. Well, somebody had that idea a long time ago. And here they are in their, 1900 garb, maybe before that, standing in the spot where we stand to get food at the food cart. Continuity of time, but again, the point is that these places over such a long period of time have been a place where people come because they're happy to be there. And here they are. Go ahead. The Ped Mall is a phenomenon. Do you know that? I wish I knew what the statistics were of how many Ped Malls were created in the 1960s and 1970s that failed. You know how many of these have been reversed because it was the worst idea in the history of their community? And yet here is this place that is life. You know, it draws people. It is intimate in its setting. When you're there, you feel like you're outside, but you're inside. It's really a special place. And there would have been a day when we would have thought, oh my, they're tearing all those buildings down. They're closing the street. I don't know what I would have been saying. I would have been throwing up my arms and saying, that's a really bad idea. You're going to regret it. And lots of people did, but it worked here. And it's a real asset to the downtown, and it's certainly central to the historic character. It's very difficult to get pictures of the Ped Mall in the summer. I borrowed this from Bobby Jett, I think, put so many wonderful pictures on Facebook. But it's an inviting place, and when it's hot in the summer, people gather there. I don't know all of the festivals that you guys do here, but I know that when my daughter was here this summer taking pictures of the buildings downtown, she stood and took pictures of, like maybe it wasn't right on the Ped Mall, but these chalk artists had done these crazy, wonderful, amazing images, and she photographed them and sent them to me and said, can you believe this? And there are people all over the place. And those sorts of things are the character of downtown Iowa City that are embraced by the historic buildings that are there. So change is inevitable. I mean, there's just no getting around of it. Some of it is uncontrollable, some of it is controllable. You guys made it through a tornado. You know what that did to your downtown. I don't have any pictures of that, but there are plenty of pictures of fires. And there is not much to be done about those sorts of things once they happen. Obviously, fire prevention is a much more refined science than it once was. But fires take buildings, and they often, when you have contiguously constructed commercial buildings, takes more than one. So here we have an example of a major fire, and the good news is that's what we got. So the Hotel Jefferson was built 1913, I think. Beautiful building, and it anchors that downtown, creates a really important anchor to that streetscape with the bank on the other end. That's one thing I always think about with this historic preservation is that I always ask, if we're going to lose something, what are we getting in its place? For a long time, what we got in its place was a parking lot. That happened everywhere. This is just another view of the Hotel Jefferson. The streetscape, the buildings between the hotel and the bank have changed since that, right, the period after the hotel was built. But the streetscape stays intact. And much more recently, what year was that when Brugge was burned and you lost all those buildings in that L shape? Not very, 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Five? And you know, an old building, maybe not sprinklered, and you know, I don't know what caused that, but what we ended up with was new construction, and obviously something had to go there. And I have no problem with any of these buildings. The one thing that I'll point out about these buildings, when we think back to my diatribe about contiguous buildings and the relationship of proportion and form in terms of alignment of the first story, alignment of the second story, this does not do that. And I don't know why that was. You know, when you've got multiple property owners, those sorts of things happen. There are all sorts of things at play, but it is a point of education, I think, when we talk about understanding what historic integrity is, what historic character is, and how loss of context impacts a streetscape. So I think these buildings individually are all interesting and contribute to the downtown, but there is a breach of historic integrity as a result of loss of the historic building and construction of new buildings that don't follow historic proportion, scale, and continuity. Urban renewal. It's a dirty word. In Minneapolis, there was what they called the Metropolitan Building. And if you can imagine the biggest red stone building you've ever seen, one of those where the stones are bigger than if I laid down, you know, they're mammoth stones. And that was in the area they called Skid Row. And it was the gateway area. It became derelict. They decided if they could tear the Metropolitan down, the whole area would turn around, right? Well, about, I don't know, 3 months later, they still couldn't get that building down. It was so well built. It's phenomenal. It is a story of the ages in Minneapolis preservation world about how stubborn that building was. And I think a lot of us got some joy out of thinking how frustrated the people were that were trying to take it down. But it was a mammoth undertaking. What happened was they ended up leveling blocks and blocks of historic buildings to get the bums out of that area. Now, you know, homeless people went and lived somewhere else, which is a logic I've never figured out why no one figured that out. But so anyway, the Metropolitan Building is one example in a big city setting of urban renewal. But urban renewal, you guys know, it was everywhere. And it seemed at the time, I'm sure, to be the right answer to a series of problems or issues that were being faced. Finances, buildings that are being dilapidated, they become a hazard to people. You know, communities trying to make something positive out of a situation that they don't really know what to do with. And so in Iowa City, these came down, and what'd you get? Capitol Mall. And I haven't really asked anybody, but I don't think the Capitol Mall, if in hindsight any of you would trade the Capitol Mall in terms of its success, its architecture, I don't know, I shouldn't even say it that way because I don't want to offend anybody, because I really do believe that people make the best decisions based on what they know at the time. The point is today in hindsight, as preservationists, we wish we still had those buildings. Am I alone in that? Okay, next. Thank you. And this is demolition, and I didn't identify, though I'm sure that they exist, because the holdings of historic images of Iowa City buildings is mind-blowing. It's so wonderful. So what I was going to say is I don't have an image of the buildings that were here, but these are the buildings. This is the site of the Plaza Center 1. And this is it going up with the Hotel Jefferson right behind it. To me, today, this building, because of its setting with the trees and the Ped Mall, is, and I have no idea how it is in terms of success as an economic growth factor, how it does for retail, but it's sensibility-wise and character-wise, because it's now a part of the Ped Mall, and that sense of intimacy is not negatively impacted by that building. So I feel better from a preservation point of view about that one, but it was a loss. I don't know. Does anybody know how many buildings were lost to build that? Half a block, right? Yeah, quarter of a block, they said. But here it is today. And again, the landscaping, it's a wonderful community space, and the trees prevent it from being kind of up front and center. But again, in 25 years? Let's see, it's 25, it's almost 50 years old. In 10 years, it will be historic. And if there was a new survey, we'd be taking a picture of it and including it with the historic buildings and talking about the importance of its architecture. And that's the fact. So the automobile is also another thing that impacts Iowa communities and communities across the country. Like lots of things, the automobile is a mixed blessing, right? I mean, I'd love to drive. I'll go for a couple days and go, okay, I gotta go to Iowa again, because I love to drive. But at the same time, it made a lot of changes in our communities in terms of how we relate to buildings and space, congestion. We all know the various factors, and it continues to be an impact here. I think it's, and we can talk about this if you want, but pretty well controlled by speed zones. My friends who live in Iowa City say, don't speed in Iowa City, they'll get you. And so I never do. Not 1 mile over do I ever speed in Iowa City. And so I think that that's effective. And then also all of the pedestrians people are used to watching. So perhaps it's less of an issue in Iowa City than in some places. Again, this is that same view, but it just shows the backdrop and the changing views. So these are kind of the things that I want to talk about a little bit as a point of conversation, and I really do want this to be more about conversation. But these are the things that I want to touch on, and wherever it takes us. But I went to a conference in Sioux City a couple months ago that was put on by Main Street, Iowa, and they talked a lot about what makes downtowns vital now. The impact of the millennials, by the way, is very big point of study in vital downtowns. The role that millennials have to play in populating a downtown, to assuming roles in protecting historic resources, their sense of interest in the real and the authentic is beginning to show itself in communities all over the country. One of the speakers said this, and it really hit me, and that is that unique doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't stay that way by accident. Lots of towns are looking for a hook, right? They're looking for a hook, a way to get people downtown. You guys don't have that problem. You don't have that problem at all. Iowa City downtown is unique. So you got that in spades. But it won't stay unique by accident. That's in your hands. Oh, that was an accidental wave. That was my overactive hands. The other thing that I think is important to acknowledge is that there's a perception that there are opposing forces. And I think that it's important to abolish that idea and to recognize that everybody has the best interests of downtown in mind. Everybody wants a vital downtown. I haven't spoken to anybody who doesn't recognize that the historic buildings downtown are important. And I also think that people also understand that evolution happens, and that this conversation between all kinds of voices is what's necessary in order to devise an approach so that your unique stays unique. I also think it's important to understand that there are economic pressures that are very real. Historic buildings are a challenge. They can be a challenge. There are also tools to help people rehabilitate and maintain historic buildings. Historic tax credits have been a phenomenal success in the state of Iowa, from small projects to enormous projects. And those are an amazing tool. The city of Iowa City, I understand, has some CDBG funds that they use to help historic rehabilitations. There are tools out there, and there are also people who understand how to get through the complexities of those programs, which I'll be the first person to tell you, historic tax credit programs can be challenging, the application process, but they are also a very important, effective tool to preserving historic downtowns. And the last thing is this idea of bringing people together, of a variety, a cross-section of people. The literary community here, the arts community, the preservationists, the retailers, the students, the retirees, and everything in between have a place in downtown. And I think there's a lot of that at play already to bring people to downtown, and I think that people are looking for other ways to assure that that grows, continues to embrace different cross sections of the community. But there is no doubt that vitality is connected to people being there, right? So before we open up to questions, I just want to thank a few people. First of all, the city of Iowa City, and I won't call out anybody by name because I was asked not to, but there are individuals who work really hard on specific projects, including this one. Generally introduced the Historic Preservation Commission, and I just want to underscore that people who serve on the Historic Preservation Commission devote a lot of time and energy to evaluating and doing everything they can to protect the historic resources of their community, and they deserve a lot of credit. I didn't put on here, and I should have, the Friends of Historic Preservation, which are also, they're a nonprofit group separate from the city of Iowa City, but they work very hard to contribute to the historic character, to preserve historic buildings. And what's the name of the building that you moved, the house? The Hauser-Metzger House. And I came to know about them actually because Cedar Rapids has a kind of an equivalent. They call it Save CR Heritage. And they moved a small house and did a rehabilitation. And the folks here in Iowa City have kind of back and forth shared efforts and information and materials so that both of those projects can be a success. I also wanted to thank the people that I've spoken to so far and the people that I'll speak to. People are very open and interested in talking about how they feel about that downtown, what they see as their vision for downtown, what they see as the challenges, and they take time out of their busy schedules to do that, and so I really, really appreciate that. The other thing, and I mentioned this, is the images are just amazing. What a treasure. And if you guys probably all know this, but the public library has a digital database, the University of Iowa has a digital database. I use that from Minneapolis, the Iowa digital database, and have for years. The Iowa State Historical Society here, their office has been here for many years. Mary Bennett is the keeper of those images, and she's like done such a wonderful job of organizing that information, and I appreciate that because it's really a very important research tool, and it gives us a chance to do what I told you before, where all of a sudden I go, oh, look at that lady in the dress down to her feet and standing by a horse. I stood there today. It helps me put that into perspective. And lastly, I thank you for coming here tonight, and I welcome all of the thoughts and things that you want to offer up tonight. The way that we'll handle this is we're going to have two folks with microphones, and if you'll just raise your hand, they will come to you. We'll see if that works all right. And how much time do we have, Bob? 20 minutes, half hour? So we got plenty of time. So does anybody want to jump in and be the first? I'm going to be really embarrassed if no one has a question. So take pity on me. I'll think it's because I'm a cyclone. I'm not really a cyclone. They're going to head right out there grabbing the mics for you. Oh, and before you speak, if you could stand up if you can and say your name. We do want this to be a conversation, so we want to know who we're speaking with, please.
I'm Maeve Clark. I work at the public library, so thank you very much. Keep using our... Can you hear me now? My name is Maeve Clark, and I work at the public library, so thank you for crediting us for our digital images. What's the time frame of this? When do you plan on being done?
So let me tell you that so far what we've done is photographed all of the historic buildings downtown in the project area. We have looked at all of the existing Iowa site forms to determine whether or not there have been any alterations to the buildings. Those that are essentially the way they were when that initial survey was done, those are pretty well done. There are some that are a little complicated because there were questions about their history or there's some significant changes. We'll be doing that. So a big chunk of that on the ground stuff is done. There will be probably two more presentations. Certainly one at the end of the project in the spring, talks about the results, and you'll all be invited. And then we'll do, we believe, another one in the middle there somewhere. So what we're looking at is to have the report and the final work done by March. And then there may be some follow-up. Bob, did you have something else you want to add about that? Will the final results be made available to the public at the time I submit it, or is there something that comes after that? Okay, so as soon as I'm done, the city will make it available. Okay?
Hi, thank you very much. I think this is a great initiative. My name is Glenn Erstein. Some of you know me already. I teach here on campus. I teach German. And for about 3 years now running, I've been involved in a project on reconstructing German immigration to the state. And one of the things that I've been doing with my students is putting them onto stories of immigrants to Iowa City and looking into local German language newspapers. So I'll also put in a plug for the Shishi, if you will, the State Historical Society collections that Mary Bennett curates and organizes. There are German language newspapers. I lived here for 20 years before I realized that Iowa City over time had 3 different German language newspapers, and there were Czech newspapers here in town as well that all pertained to the 19th century immigration context in historic downtown. When you look at those newspapers, one of the things that jumps out immediately are advertisements for local businesses. So, we have records of, in German, Moses' Bloom, One Price Clothing Store on Clinton Street, Weatherby's Gallery in German, advertising in German, and of course all the breweries, which are not necessarily in your survey district. In any case, I would be happy to, if you're interested in German language materials, I would actually encourage you to provide perhaps some German language materials, Czech language materials to indicate the relevance of these buildings for immigration context as well. Anything that you could do to point out the diversity of the community I think would be very welcome. So African American participation and business owners downtown. Also just helping to understand the relevance of the 19th century immigration context for the contemporary immigration context as well, including linguistic communities, Spanish speakers, et cetera, who are otherwise not easily visible. And then I'll just close by putting in a plug. This is really perhaps something for after the survey and maybe something more for the Chamber of Commerce downtown. But I know that the university and specifically the Iowa's Writer Workshop and the IWP as part of the Iowa City as City of Literature, they have a walking tour app that you can download to your iPhone. and it indicates the importance of certain sites downtown and in the local neighborhoods. I do believe there are some downtown structures that are part of that, so it might be worth looking and reaching out to some of the university people involved with that. And I think that would be an excellent thing to put together after the survey so that anyone visiting the community could really walk around downtown and just download this app. And it would be the walk rather than, you could put up signs on the facades, of course, but you can provide a lot more information using that walking tour. And I just forgot to mention, if you need someone to actually read some of the Czech materials from the 19th century Czech newspapers in town, Bob Miklo might be interested in putting his Czech skills to use. That's all. Thank you very much.
That last one must be a joke, because Bob's going... Thank you for those ideas, and we are taking down information and ideas that people offer, so I think those are both really good ideas, so we'll be sure to look at those. The German newspaper, it had never occurred to me. That's great. Who else?
Hi, my name's Karen Cubby. I co-own Beatology Iowa, and I'm a member of the downtown district, the Iowa City Downtown District. And I'm really interested in making sure that your report doesn't sit on a shelf and gain dust. So I'm very interested if your recommendations will have some recommended next action steps, specifically for me, because I also believe in this evolution and I'm not as afraid of density. But if density is not in context of the historic buildings and really negatively impedes upon the streetscape at the pedestrian level, that can be a negative impact from my perspective. And so I'm hoping that in your recommendations you might have some ways other communities have allowed new buildings, new looks, and streetscape design that helps keep our nice pedestrian flow emotionally and physically downtown.
What I can tell you for sure, Karen, is that those I've heard those voices. Certainly the issue about new construction and how and the need for density and how you introduce that into a historic district without negatively impacting the historic resources. So there will definitely be some dedicated, thoughtful narrative about what I have heard, recommendations about. What I'll try to do is pull the voices together and represent them accurately and offer some direction. What I will also say is that I'll work with the city, and we talk about this process as I do it. There's continuing kind of refinement about, okay, this is what we've learned, so maybe where we thought we were going to zig, we should zag. So I'll talk to them about this idea of, when it comes to the report, how much or how far do I need or should I go in terms of precise recommendations and examples from other places. But we certainly take note of that. Thank you.
My name's Josh Moe, and I am an architect here in Iowa City, downtown. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about storefronts versus upper levels, because as you showed in your pictures, the storefronts of buildings change all of the time. We have some historic buildings that have gone through multiple different storefronts, but the upper levels sort of stay the same. And I know different historians have different attitudes about the importance of the storefront and signage and the upper stories versus just context and continuity. I think I kind of understand your approach, but I'd like to hear more about that, just because we don't have many storefronts that are originals, and I don't know that, I think there's a misperception sometimes that original is historic, and I just wanted you to comment on that.
Sure. So I'll do this, Josh, and then if I need to say more, we'll talk more about it. So yes, storefronts change. I mean, you can see it in your lifetime in Iowa City, how many times a new business went into a storefront, and it's only logical that a popcorn dealer, is there such thing as a popcorn dealer, and someone who sells clothes, what their storefront looks like is going to be very different, or what they need in order to sell their wares changes. And I think that's even more so now when there's a lot of retail competition with online entities like Amazon. So retailers are constantly reinventing themselves. And they also want an identity, a brand that shows on their storefront. So they change. And you're right, there are very few historic storefronts in terms of original to the original building. I don't know. I don't know whether they exist. Some have been reconstructed so that their form is similar to what would have been historic, right? So let me just say that word historic. From the National Park Service relative to the National Register of Historic Places, 50 years is the guide for something being considered historic. Anything that you put on the National Register or try to nominate to the National Register that's less than 50 years old, you have to make a special case for that, and that does happen. So if we are looking at a building where the upper stories look like they were built in 1880, and we have two storefronts, and one storefront looks like it was built in or rehab most recently in 1950, say, and the other one was last week, then we have this complex sort of facade that we have to evaluate. And so from the National Register perspective and local guideline perspective, what we have to decide is, as a whole, and would be when I'm trying to determine whether it's a contributing resource to a historic district, a non-contributing resource, or individually eligible. We look at the building as a whole and decide whether or not, despite the alterations, whether or not it retains a level of historic integrity that allows it to continue to contribute to the significance of the district, if that's what we're talking about. Does that so far make sense? Okay, so the other thing, however, that changes is if we have a building that has two facades, and facade A, which is 50 years old, that building owner wants to do a historic rehabilitation and use federal funds to do it, and the person who has a newer storefront that's not historic, how that's evaluated in terms of the historic character is different for a historic tax credit program. And I think that's a little too much detail probably to go into, but I say that just so people understand that it's important to keep in mind that how you talk about historic character varies between National Register nominations and historic tax credit programs. Does that help? Did I tell you enough? No? What more can I say?
False, and so I wanted you to comment on that.
So, in case you missed the beginning, his point was that sometimes there's a perception that historic preservation projects don't allow changes to historic storefronts. And his position is that's not true. My position is that's not true. What I think probably the clearest way to say it is that if you were going to make a change to your historic storefront, what you would want to do is to do it in such a way that it does not negatively impact the character of the whole, right? And so whatever the change is should respect the original opening, the proportion, the scale. There are like the bones of the historic storefront the upright columns, the knee walls or the bulkheads, the transoms, if those are in place and you're using federal money, they wouldn't allow you to remove those, but they would allow you to work within an existing skeleton. So I think the bottom line and the answer to your question is there's a lot more wiggle room than it might often appear. And the bottom line is be respectful of the rest of the building. Thanks, Josh.
Hi there.
Hi.
My name is Quentin Mishek. I grew up in Iowa City and I work at the University of Iowa now. I just want to say thank you for your presentation. It was really insightful. And even though I grew up here, it's still amazing to see what we had and what we lost in the past. I feel like I should say this as a millennial. I do want to say my 2 cents and say that growth is still really important. I grew up in Iowa City, going to the Ped Mall. I still frequent the Ped Mall, for lunch, dinner, what have you, film scene. But I do recognize that for our city to grow and for it to attract and retain young people and young families, we have to have growth. So I think there's really some great opportunities for growth downtown. I think projects like Plaza Towers, it was built on a library parking lot, right, at the time, and has really added to the synergy of the Ped Mall. And I am personally in favor of some larger scale, taller buildings downtown while maintaining the historic character that we have. I don't want to see us rest on our laurels and only have 3- and 4-story buildings if they all look the same. So, thank you.
And I appreciate that comment, and that's certainly one of the discussions now is how is historic scale relative to contemporary scale, and how do you marry those? Do you marry those? A placement and relationship of the street, and that's an important conversation. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So thank you. Anybody else?
Okay. My name is Thomas Agrin, and disclosure here that I serve on the Preservation Commission, and I also work for the Iowa City Downtown District, but I don't speak this evening for either of those organizations. First off, just to respond to that, as a millennial, I would say that Paris holds all of their buildings at a certain height, and I think we generally agree that that's a pretty nice place as well. So I am in favor of big buildings too, but food for thought. One thing that we run into on the commission, or at least a strategy in the time that I've served on the commission, is that when a district is formed, it's ideal if the interest from that district or from the designation of a property as a historic landmark, whatever, comes from the people who own property in that district or own that building. There are examples where that hasn't been the case. So I'm going to string together a few different thoughts here. So, the downtown, it was very hard to see, given the speculative value of the buildings and properties there, that strategy would work very well. And I do think that new buildings should be built as well, which is part of what gives those old buildings that elevated value. I was in a meeting the other day where someone who owns property downtown, an older building, who sunk a lot of money into fixing that building up, complained that it would have been cheaper to tear down the building and build a new one, but also that there was the building got taxed at a much higher level after that, so he felt like he was being punished for having fixed up that building. So the last thing out of that, which is maybe more of a comment, is that when these old buildings, I think, have a value to the community that exceeds the value or is somehow disconnected from the value that the building owner has, because they might have other financial reasons they need to develop the property or interested in developing the property or whatever. And so if those buildings are really a piece of the an architectural piece of the vitality of downtown, then I would really like to see, we as a community, as a government, throw resources at different projects. We give away incentive bonuses, and we change zoning, and we give TIF funding. We do all kinds of things, and it would be really nice to see if these buildings if the community values these buildings more than maybe some of the individual building owners do, if there can be greater incentives, a stronger hand from the government in Iowa City to help make that change. So rather than twisting anyone's arm or, I don't know, if we can just somehow make a greater incentive and acknowledgement from the city that this is a core asset, and while we can have bigger buildings built, especially on the many empty parking lots, surface street parking that we have in Iowa City, more leadership from the government would be really great to see, I think.
I'm not sure how to respond to that. So,
I don't think I'm asking for a response.
okay. I hear what you're saying, and I have heard people concerned about. I mean, there's a whole thing about how you make historic buildings financially viable. All of those pieces that come into play about cost of maintaining them, making them the retail space viable for today's retailers, and not just the storefronts, but the interior space. There's issues about the interior spaces being too long, and today's retail world needs to be closer to the front, and you lose all of this usable space. And so how do you think creatively about using the backs of these buildings, the issues related to investing and then having taxes go up, feeling like that is counterproductive to having done it. So those issues are things that I've heard, and but I appreciate you reiterating them, saying them out loud here for this group, and the applause tells me that you've got more than one person who agrees with you.
Hi, my name is Annette, and I grew up here in Iowa City, and I'm going to more of what he was talking about, the connection to the buildings, the versus the I don't know how to say it, but all I need to say is that everywhere that I grew up no longer exists, and that's really sad. So the connection to buildings and spaces and places is very important. And when I come to Iowa City, coming here is a big part of is being downtown, and coming through downtown and being connected. And it's really hard to be here when it doesn't look the same. And the amount of economic development that's being taken place, that the amount of money that is being seen by the buildings is not the traditional Iowa City way. And Iowa City, although the businesses were here and people shopped and were connected to the businesses, that doesn't really seem to be a part of who we are anymore. And I don't, it's more about what he was saying about the connection to the people in the buildings.
I think it's an important point, because we acknowledge that the streetscapes change, but we didn't acknowledge that the fact that changes how we experience those spaces, but also how our identity changes. It's discombobulating. I don't know if that's the right word, but sometimes when you go to a place that was so familiar, most of us have gone maybe back to our hometowns. I grew up in Fort Dodge. It looks nothing like it did. And you do feel like that you've lost something. And most of us don't realize how, I think it's hard to recognize that in the moment. So thank you.
I'm Dawn Eckrich, and I'm from Iowa City, born and raised. And I just learned tonight that I'm historic since I'm over 50. But I have to agree with the lady that just spoke. This is my home. My family worked here. Everybody went to school, farmed around here. It has been very hard for me to see buildings go down and glass and metal structures go up. And I've come to the conclusion that everything does change. And that's helped me cope with this, because this all has been, downtown change has been very hard for me personally. Along with your study, I would like to see the next study or part of your study be, okay, we have these historical buildings. What type of building do we allow to be built that would complement them? That's what I see as the biggest challenge the downtown area faces. These buildings are old. I mean, thank the Lord we don't have a fire, but it would be devastating to our downtown. And so, you know, can there be a complementary mix or such? Do you get my?
I do.
Yeah.
Because natural disasters happen, changes, right, and certainly part of the thinking and the listening and the recommendations are when new construction is appropriate, how do you create some sort of a mechanism or a way of thinking or approach. And it's not my job to determine guidelines, but my job is to provide some insight from the voices that I've heard about how people are feeling about that and provide some recommendation. And where, you know, then it's out of my hands.
Hi, my name's Jo Dickens, and I too was raised in Iowa City, born. In fact, my grandparents, my great-grandparents grew up here. And just to give a little bit of different perspective from what we just heard, is I love the fact that Iowa City has grown and changed, and I like the growth we've seen downtown. My grandfather had his insurance business downtown, so I remember what we used to be, and I think we've improved. I think we're have more vitality. And so I think some of us older people love to see the big buildings, love to see the glass, love to see the historical part of it, but that doesn't mean we can't coexist. And I hope that we continue on the growth pattern. We need it economically to survive. We've got a lot of competition out there from other people, from other community areas. And I think it's very important that we continue with our growth, coexisting new with the old.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Anybody else? Right here.
I'm Jim Swaim, married to Ginny.
Uh-oh.
I just wondered, throughout your study, the pressures from the university for additional space is something that's happening. There's a current property that's being looked at. You'll take that into account, I assume, but do you have experiences from other communities where the university is both an asset but also just puts pressure on existing properties downtown? Because, I mean, the university would love to have several more buildings downtown. And I just wondered if you could comment on that.
It's a unique situation in some ways. It's unique in my experience. The closest experience I've had to that is in Cedar Rapids, where the hospitals are pushing into historic residential neighborhoods in particular. And I know some of the efforts that the city and the Historic Preservation Commission there have undertaken in order to try to make an end run around that. I think that's different, however, because there's more of a symbiotic relationship between the university and the city than there is between the hospital in Cedar Rapids and the city. I am having a conversation with folks at the university, so I'll be able to get their perspective and hear their position about that. But I do understand that's a concern, and they're a big institution, so it's certainly something that has to be part of the conversation.
My name's Harry Olmstead, and I've noticed there's been interest in some of the businesses to have rooftop cafes. I'm wondering how you feel about that. Does it take away from the integrity and historical factors?
So the issue of rooftop cafes is from a evaluating historic integrity perspective, specific to whether something's eligible on the National Register. is typically if you can stand on the street and not see, then it's not considered to have a negative impact. So it wouldn't keep a building from being counted as a contributing resource or even an individually eligible resource, provided that the historic integrity, other than that particular point, is intact. For me, it's a trend. It may well be a trend that ends at some point. I mean, lots of trends blow themselves out after a while, but it's a hot trend, and it's a trend that is useful in terms of economics to downtown business owners. So I think as long as it doesn't negatively impact the historic character, I think it's okay.
Hi, my name's Mackenzie Krob, and I'm the executive director at Old Brick downtown here. We're outside the district, but we're on the National Register. I'm actually speaking as a former Main Street person, and I'm wondering about the upper story counts. Is that going to be included in your survey? How many upper story units are in, like, the historic buildings, and is there opportunities for, rehabbing those? And I think that's been, there's some that have been neglected, I think, in the downtown area. And so are you going to talk about that in your report at all?
A survey of the upper stories is not part of this project. I was trying to remember, Bob, we had a passing conversation about the issue of upper stories, and I don't remember if you said there had been an upper story survey to know. Do we know how many potential housing units there are upstairs?
There hasn't been an official survey of the city, but the city has looked at some code amendments that would allow it easier to reuse some of those spaces. And we've passed some zoning incentives, like waiving parking requirements for reuse of existing buildings. So there are some tools in place to allow that to occur, and we've seen it in several buildings. So I think it's turned out well in those buildings, such as the old Gringo's restaurant. That's upper floor is now an apartment. Above Gilda's Imports, that's now a couple of apartments. So it is something that is occurring.
I would add that in a couple of the conversations that I've had with folks, one point was made to me that, and actually it was kind of conflicting opinions, but we have a lot of conflicting opinions, so I'll throw it out there. But there is the question of livability downtown on second and third floors because of the activity downtown on the weekends. And so to me, that's still a point of conversation. It sounds as though it's a more amenable to people in the Plaza Towers because of they're up far enough above the street level that it doesn't seem to be a problem. But someone did indicate they thought that was a challenge to upper story living unless it was students. Okay, you worn out yet? So next steps, I think we asked you to stay a part of the conversation, and I hope that you put your name and contact information down so that we can keep you in the loop. If you have any questions for me directly, you can reach me through the city, or my website is akayconsulting.com, and that's AKAY consulting.com. And I'm very open to having you folks contact me and give me your thoughts or ask me questions. I certainly would welcome that. Thank you really very much, and we'll let you know what comes next.